Yes, I think it's worth stressing that the choice isn't really between interference and non-interference, because humans already interfere in the living world in all sorts of ways, ranging from uncontrolled habitat destruction to rewilding, captive breeding programs for big cats, a whole host of different ways. Rather, the question is, what ethical principles, if any, should govern our interventions, our stewardship of nature? Should we aim for a traditional kind of conservation biology in which the well-being of individual organisms was not taken into account at all, or should we aim for a compassionate biology? And I think the ethically responsible thing to do is to aim for a compassionate biology in our wildlife parks. As well as ethical, ideological objections to the abolitionist project, I think a lot of people are subject to what one might call status quo bias. And one way to counteract status quo bias is perhaps to consider a thought experiment. How would we react if we were to stumble across an alien civilization whose members had phased out the biology of suffering, who enjoyed lives animated by gradients of bliss, and in their wildlife parks there was no longer predation, disease, parasitism, all the cruelties of nature as we experience them today? What arguments, if any, would we use to try and persuade them to reintroduce suffering, aging, disease, parasitism, all the nastiness of life? I suspect they would regard us not just as mistaken, but frankly they would regard us as almost psychotic, and I think they would be right to do so, given that biotechnology does allow us, in principle at least, to re-engineer ourselves, to edit our own genetic source code and re-engineer the rest of the living world and design compassionate ecosystems. I think ethically it is the appropriate thing to do. Now, I personally am an ethical utilitarian, but the abolitionist project is not critically dependent on your being any kind of utilitarian, whether a hedonistic utilitarian, preference utilitarian, negative utilitarian. You can be a deontologist, a virtue theorist, even a Christian, certainly a Buddhist. All that is necessary is that you accept this basic principle that sentient beings should not be forced to suffer against their will. If you're prepared to allow this quite basic ethical principle, then a lot of the abolitionist project follows quite naturally. I think a virtue ethicist would probably say that the suffering of non-human animals only really matters except so far as it reflects the virtues and the character of human beings, and that behaving cruelly towards non-human animals is likely to make humans behave badly towards each other. Now, I think it probably is the case that in many cases people who are cruel to non-human animals go on to behave cruelly towards other adult humans and other children. If you look at the lives of the serial killers, most of them seem to have behaved in quite appalling ways to non-human animals, but equally there have been plenty of cases of small children who've been cruel to animals and haven't gone on to be serial killers. So yes, consistent with virtue ethics, though it doesn't obviously follow straightforwardly from virtue ethics. But as I said, given, thanks to technology, that the well-being or ill-being of the rest of the living world is very much now within our grasp, that for better or worse humans do now enjoy godlike powers over the rest of the living world, I think it's incumbent on us to use these godlike powers ethically and responsibly. And that whereas 100 years ago the terrible suffering that occurred, whether in Africa, famine, or members of other species, may have been bad, but it's difficult to call it immoral because it wasn't our fault. as this century progresses, and certainly next century and beyond, any suffering that does occur in nature, whether in our own species or other species, is very much going to be a matter of choice. I mean, if I said perhaps one shouldn't specify dates too closely, but if suffering of any form exists 200 years from now, I don't think it will be because it was too difficult, too technically challenging to abolish its substrates. It will exist because, for whatever reason, rational agents, ethical agents will have chosen to preserve it. So, as I said, technology radically extends our sphere of responsibility. Yes, my own ethical position is negative utilitarianism. I think we have an ethical obligation to minimize suffering. That is our overriding ethical obligation. That might sound somewhat odd from someone who advocates and predicts a future of life animated by gradients of well-being that are orders of magnitude richer than anything physiologically feasible today, but essentially, ethically speaking, there doesn't seem in any straightforward sense to be any kind of ethical urgency to maximizing the well-being of the already happy, whereas there does seem to be an ethical urgency to relieving suffering. I'd stress again, though, that to sign up for the abolitionist project, it's not necessary to be a negative utilitarian or any kind of utilitarian at all, just minimal benevolence towards other sentient beings. Perhaps rather than speaking of negative utilitarianism, it would be better to speak of Buddhism. Buddha, after all, located overcoming suffering at the heart of the world. That was the core message of Buddha. And the only real difference, one might argue ethically, between a Buddhist ethic of alleviating and abolishing suffering and where we stand today is that until modern biotechnology was developed, it was going to be impossible to dismantle the food chain or recalibrate the hedonic treadmill or anything like that. That the Noble Eightfold Path is not going to edit our genetic source code. So yes, may all that hath life be delivered from suffering, said Gautama Buddha, and I think that's as good a way of summarising the abolitionist project as any.